Looking back, I can't pinpoint the exact moment it all started. Maybe it was weeks ago, months even. Maybe the signs had been there, subtle but persistent, like a slow leak in the foundation of our marriage. Emily and I had been together for 10 years. A decade of love, trust, and routine. She was the kind of woman who turned heads without trying, elegant, confident, with a quiet intensity that drew people in. I had always felt lucky to have her. Maybe that was my first mistake, thinking luck had anything to do with it. Lately, something had shifted. It was small at first. A glance that lingered too long on her phone. A sudden burst of laughter at a message she didn't share. Late afternoons where she'd disappear for a few hours, brushing off my questions with a casual, just running errands. I told myself I was imagining things. That the distance between us was just a result of my work schedule. I had been buried in a major case for months, spending long nights at the office, pushing for a promotion that now felt meaningless. Then Mark sent the text. "Hey man, were you at Blackwood Café today?" I frowned. "No, why?" A pause. Thought I saw Emily. She wasn't alone. I stared at the screen, my grip tightening around the phone. Who was she with? Another pause. Longer this time. Some guy. Tall, dark hair. They looked close. That was the moment the first real crack appeared. That night, when I walked through the door, Emily was in the kitchen, pouring herself a glass of wine. She turned and smiled at me like nothing had changed. Like she wasn't somewhere else just hours ago, with someone else. I kissed her. I told myself it was the same as always. But it wasn't. Because now, doubt had moved in. And doubt doesn't leave quietly. I wanted to believe Mark was wrong. That he had mistaken some stranger for Emily. That there was a perfectly reasonable explanation. But once doubt sets in, it spreads like ink in water. The next morning, I left for work as usual, but I wasn't thinking about contracts or legal briefs. My mind was on her. On the way she had smiled at me last night, the way she had touched my arm, asked about my day, small gestures I had never questioned before. Now, they felt rehearsed. At lunch, I found myself staring at my phone, debating whether to text her. "Where are you? What are you doing?" Simple questions. Questions I had never needed to ask before. Instead, I put my phone down and told myself I was being ridiculous. That night, I came home early. I didn't text her first. I wanted to see if she expected me. I pulled into the driveway. The house was dark. Emily's car wasn't there. I sat in the silence of my own doubt, gripping the steering wheel as the minutes ticked by. At 9:14 p.m., headlights appeared down the street. A moment later, Emily's car pulled in beside mine. She stepped out, carrying a small paper bag, takeout from a restaurant across town. "You're home early," she said, her voice light as she walked toward me. "Yeah," I said, watching her carefully. "Thought I'd surprise you." She smiled and held up the bag. "I picked up dinner. I didn't think you'd be back yet." It was a small lie. One I might not have noticed before. But I knew Emily. She never got takeout from that place. She didn't even like it. I kissed her cheek and took the bag from her hands. Her perfume lingered, faint, unfamiliar. Not the one she usually wore. That night, as she showered, I did something I had never done before. I checked her phone. The screen was locked, of course, but I wasn't looking for messages. Just something. Some small sign. I scrolled through her recent calls. One stood out. A number with no name. A number that had been called twice today. I stared at it for a long time before putting the phone down. I had a choice. I could ignore this. Pretend nothing was wrong. Go on living in the version of my marriage I had always believed in. Or I could find out the truth. And I wasn't sure which terrified me more. The number stayed with me. It wasn't just the fact that she had called it twice. It was that it had no name. Every other contact in her phone was labeled, friends, family, work. But this? This was something she wanted to keep hidden. That night, as Emily slept beside me, I stared at the ceiling, running through possibilities. Maybe it was innocent. A work call. A delivery service. Something ordinary. But deep down, I didn't believe that. The next day, I did something I never thought I would do. I called the number. It rang twice before a man's voice answered. Hello. I didn't speak. I just listened. Silence stretched between us, heavy and unnatural. Then the voice came again, sharper this time. Emily. I hung up. My pulse was a slow, steady drum in my ears. I sat at my desk, staring at my phone, feeling something cold settle in my chest. He knew her. He expected her. I could have confronted her that night. Demanded an explanation. But I didn't. Because I needed more than suspicion. I needed proof. So I started watching. Emily's routine had never seemed unusual before, but now, every movement, every small change, stood out. The way she checked her phone more often but never left it unattended. The way she started running more errands in the evenings, always with vague explanations. One night, I told her I had a late meeting. I left the house at 7, drove a few blocks away, and waited. At 7:42 p.m., she left. I followed at a distance, my heart hammering against my ribs. She drove across town, past the familiar streets of our life together, into a part of the city we never had reason to visit. She pulled into a parking lot behind a small, dimly lit bar. She sat in the car for a moment, checking her phone. Then she got out. And I saw him. Tall. Dark hair. Standing by the entrance, waiting for her. Emily walked straight to him. No hesitation. No nerves. And then she smiled. Not the polite, practiced smile she gave to strangers. Not the tired, distracted smile she gave me lately. This was different. This was real. And I felt something inside me break. I should have walked away. I should have turned the car around, gone home, and told myself I didn't see what I saw. But I didn't. Instead, I sat there, gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white, watching my wife walk toward another man like she belonged to him. She didn't look over her shoulder. Didn't check her surroundings. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't afraid. Because she had done this before. They disappeared inside the bar, and I felt something in my chest tighten like a vice. I could have followed them in. Could have walked straight up to her and demanded an explanation. But that wasn't enough. I needed to see everything. I parked across the street and got out. My legs felt heavy, like they belonged to someone else. Every step toward that bar felt like stepping further into something I couldn't come back from. Inside, the place was dimly lit, filled with low chatter and the clinking of glasses. A band was playing in the corner, drowning out the sound of my own pulse hammering in my ears. And then I saw them. A small booth near the back. Close. Too close. His arm rested on the table, inches from hers. She was laughing, tilting her head toward him, her fingers brushing against his wrist as she spoke. I had seen her like this before, years ago, when we first started dating. That softness in her eyes, that unguarded expression. That was how she used to look at me. And now, it belonged to someone else. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but I didn't need to. Their body language said everything. She was comfortable with him. Familiar. This wasn't the first time they had been here together. I stood there for too long, the air in my lungs growing heavier by the second. Part of me wanted to march over there, drag her outside, force her to explain. But another part of me, the part that had already accepted the truth, just wanted to know how far this had gone. How long had I been living in a lie? Emily reached across the table and touched his hand. A simple touch, but intimate in a way that cut through me like a blade. I turned and walked out. The cold night air hit me like a slap, but it didn't clear my head. My hands were shaking as I got back in the car. I could still see them through the window, leaning into each other like the rest of the world didn't exist. I had my answer. But I wasn't ready for what came next. I sat in my car for an hour, watching them. Watching her. They never looked around. Never worried about being seen. That meant they felt safe. Which meant this wasn't new. At 9:27 p.m., they got up. Emily led the way, walking slightly ahead, like she was trying to create distance between them. A habit, maybe. Something to keep up appearances, just in case. But once they stepped outside, that distance disappeared. He placed his hand on the small of her back as they walked toward the parking lot. She didn't flinch, didn't pull away. They reached her car. She turned to him, said something I couldn't hear. Then he leaned in. And she let him. I clenched my jaw so hard I thought my teeth would crack. It wasn't a long embrace, but it was enough. A slow pull away, lingering eye contact. I had spent 10 years with Emily. I knew every shift in her expressions, every nuance in her body language. That wasn't goodbye. That was see you soon. I gripped the steering wheel, trying to breathe through the tightness in my chest as he walked away. He got into a dark SUV, pulled out of the lot, and disappeared down the street. Emily stood by her car for a moment, checking her phone. Then she got in and drove home. I followed, keeping my distance. By the time I parked in our driveway, she was already inside. The lights were on in the kitchen, and through the window, I saw her pour herself a glass of wine. Casual. Normal. Like she hadn't just spent the last 2 hours with another man. I sat there, staring at the house I had built with her. The life we had made. I thought about the anniversaries, the vacations, the nights we spent dreaming about the future. And now, all of it was a lie. I checked my phone. The unknown number. I stared at it, my finger hovering over the screen. Then, without thinking, I saved it. Unknown contact, him. I wasn't done yet. I needed to know exactly who he was. And I needed to know why she had chosen him over me. I barely slept that night. Emily came to bed late, smelling of wine and something faintly unfamiliar. She slipped under the covers without a word, her body turning away from mine. I stared at the ceiling, listening to her slow, steady breathing, wondering how long I had been sleeping next to a stranger. By morning, I had a plan. I left for work as usual, kissed her on the cheek, told her I'd be home late. She smiled like nothing had changed. Like she wasn't living 2 lives. The moment I was alone, I went to work, not on contracts or court filings, but on him. I started with the number. A reverse lookup gave me a name, Ryan Whitmore. The name meant nothing to me. But it would. A quick search pulled up more details. He was 36, a financial consultant, single. He lived in a high-rise downtown. No wife. No kids. No attachments. The kind of man who had nothing to lose. I scrolled through his social media. Private. Of course. But his LinkedIn was open. A polished professional headshot, the kind of face people trusted with their money. A few vague articles about investment strategies. He looked ordinary. But he wasn't. I knew what I had seen. I wasn't dealing with a casual flirtation. This wasn't a mistake Emily would wake up regretting. This was something real. Something deliberate. I needed more. That night, I told Emily I was working late again. Instead, I parked 2 blocks from our house and waited. At 7:19 p.m., she left. This time, she didn't go to the bar. She drove across town, pulling into the garage of a high-rise. His building. I gripped the steering wheel, my pulse hammering in my ears. I should have left. Should have turned around before I saw something I couldn't take back. But I didn't. Instead, I got out of the car and followed. The garage was quiet, the fluorescent lights humming overhead. Emily entered through a side door, using her phone to check the building directory. Then she got into the elevator. I took the stairs. By the time I reached the 10th floor, I was breathing hard, my heart slamming against my ribs. The hallway was empty, lined with sleek apartment doors. Then I heard it, Emily's voice. Soft, laughing. And his. The sound of a door unlocking. A pause. Then the door closed. And just like that, my wife was inside another man's apartment. I pressed my back against the wall, staring at the ceiling, my hands clenched into fists. I had spent the last 10 years believing in Emily. In us. But now, standing in that empty hallway, listening to my wife behind another man's door. I wasn't sure what I believed anymore. I don't know how long I stood there. 5 minutes. 10. Long enough for reality to settle in, for the last traces of doubt to be burned away. Emily was inside. With him. I could have knocked. Could have pounded on the door, forced her to face me. Demanded an explanation. But what would she say? It's not what you think. That lie wouldn't work anymore. I needed to be smart. I took a slow breath, turned, and walked away. My legs felt like they belonged to someone else, like I was moving through water. In the garage, I sat in my car, staring at the elevator doors, waiting. I needed to know how long she would stay. Minutes crawled by. 30. 60. 90. At 10:52 p.m., the elevator doors slid open, and Emily stepped out. Her hair was slightly messy, like she had run her fingers through it too many times. Her sweater was wrinkled. She wasn't smiling now. She walked to her car, glanced around, casual, not guilty. She had done this before. Enough times to feel safe. She drove off, and I followed at a distance. Back home, she moved through the house like it was any other night. She washed up, changed into pajamas, scrolled through her phone on the couch. When I walked in, she looked up and smiled. Hey. How was work? I felt something dark coil inside me. Long, I said. I watched her carefully, waiting for a sign. A flicker of guilt, hesitation, something. But there was nothing. Because this was normal to her. She came to bed late, curling up beside me like she hadn't just spent the night in another man's apartment. Like she hadn't just burned our marriage to the ground. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my mind spiraling. She wasn't going to tell me. She had already decided that I wasn't worth the truth. And that meant she had no idea what was coming next. Lying next to her that night, I felt nothing. No anger. No sadness. Just a cold, calculated stillness. She had made her choice. Now it was my turn. The next morning, I left before she woke up. I needed time to think, to plan. Because that's what this was now, a strategy. If Emily thought she could live 2 lives without consequences, she was wrong. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to confront her like some desperate, heartbroken husband. I was going to take control. I called a private investigator. A professional. Someone who could get me proof, undeniable, irrefutable proof of exactly how deep this went. I already had the name. The number. The address. I handed everything over. I need pictures, I told him. Times. Dates. I want to know everything. He didn't ask questions. Just nodded and got to work. For the next few days, I pretended. I kissed Emily in the morning. I asked about her day. I laughed at her stories. And all the while, I watched her. I noticed the little things now, the way she always kept her phone face down. The way she'd disappear into the other room for calls, her voice hushed but comfortable. The way she seemed lighter, freer, like she had shed some invisible weight. She wasn't conflicted. She wasn't struggling with guilt. She had already moved on. She just hadn't told me yet. That's what stung the most. Not the betrayal itself, but the ease of it. She thought I was blind. She thought I was weak. She had no idea that every step she took brought me closer to the end. And I was going to make sure she never saw it coming. The private investigator worked fast. 3 days later, I had everything I needed. Photos. Time-stamped. Clear. Emily and Ryan at the bar. Emily entering his apartment. Emily leaving his apartment, hours later. I stared at the images, feeling nothing. The man in those pictures, my wife's secret, looked ordinary. Not particularly handsome. Not particularly remarkable. Just a man. And yet, she had risked everything for him. I didn't know what I hated more, the betrayal itself or the fact that she thought I would never figure it out. That night, I acted normal. I sat across from Emily at dinner, watching the way she smiled, the way she lied so effortlessly. I might go to bed early, she said, swirling the last sip of wine in her glass. It's been a long day. A long day of what? Cheating. Lying. Pretending. I forced a smile. Yeah. You look tired. She laughed softly. Thanks for that. And just like that, she kissed my cheek and walked upstairs, without a clue. I stayed downstairs, waiting. Listening. At exactly 11:07 p.m., I heard the soft vibration of her phone upstairs. A message. I didn't move. I didn't have to. I knew who it was. Ryan. I clenched my jaw, my fingers digging into the edge of the table. This was the last night I was going to let this continue. I had seen enough. By tomorrow, Emily's double life would come crashing down. And I was going to make sure I was the one who lit the match. I woke up before Emily the next morning. I sat at the kitchen table, my phone in my hands, staring at the evidence I had gathered, the photos, the time logs, the messages my investigator had retrieved. Everything was here. Every lie, every betrayal, every moment she thought I would never see. At 7:42 a.m., she came downstairs, rubbing her eyes. Completely unaware. Morning, she mumbled, heading for the coffee maker. I didn't answer. I just watched her. She poured her coffee, took a sip, then finally turned to me. What's wrong? I slid my phone across the table. She frowned, glancing down at the screen. The first photo was open. Her. With him. She didn't move at first. Didn't blink. Then, slowly, she set her coffee cup down, her fingers tightening around the counter. David. Don't, I cut her off, my voice low. Controlled. Don't say a word. Not yet. She swallowed hard. I could see her mind racing, searching for a way out, for a way to twist this into something salvageable. She had no way out. I let the silence stretch, let her feel the weight of it. Finally, I spoke. How long? Her mouth opened, then closed. A pause. Then. A few months. A few months. I nodded slowly. How long were you going to keep lying to me? Her eyes darted to the phone again. She wasn't crying. She wasn't begging. Because deep down, she had already made peace with this moment. She had already chosen him. I exhaled sharply and stood up. I packed a bag, I said. I'll be gone by the afternoon. The divorce papers will follow soon after. Now, she flinched. David, wait. I turned to face her. Finally, she looked scared. You had every chance to tell me the truth, I said. You didn't. She stared at me, her lips parted, searching for something to say. There was nothing left. I picked up my keys, walked to the door, and stepped outside. And as I pulled away from the house we had built together, I felt nothing. No anger. No heartbreak. No regret. Only the certainty that I would never let someone make a fool of me again.